Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to the Did They Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about Ferrari. How did Ferrari stack up against the teams around them? How did the drivers stack up to the drivers around them? How did they stack up against my preseason predictions? And how did they stack up against my in-season ratings? This is what we'll be talking about today, and without further ado, we will switch over to this nice little chart here that shows Ferrari in the third position officially in the Constructors' Championship. Now, where did I have them predicted them in my preseason prediction? I had them in first place, so I was a little bit off there. I was thinking Ferrari was going to come back strong and be able to take over from that preseason testing. It looked like they were, ready to go, and it was this year that they were going to be Ferrari's year, and that did not turn out to be the case. In fact, they didn't make it to second position. They ended up in third. Still on the podium positions, but not where they wanted to be. Now, where did my in-season rating have them? In fourth. So they actually were better officially than my in-season rating came out to be. And how did I get my in-season rating? Well, I rated each of their drivers from 1 to 10 for each race, and then had those average of those scores came out to the score for the team, which was a score of 6.93, which put them in fourth position. So, where did Carlos Sainz end up? Well, his official drivers' championship was seventh. And where did I have him predicted in my preseason rating? Was third. So quite a bit up from where he ended up in the official standings. But where my in-season rating came out was ninth. So he did a lot better than my in-season rating did for him throughout this season with a score of 6.66. And no, that was not designed to be the devil or anything regarding that scenario. It just happened to come out to be that average for him throughout this season. So I think he's doing a decent job, just not where he needs to be. He's having a little bit too many mistakes, I think, to continue on into that kind of that third position where I had him going to be predicted for this preseason, and he needs to get a little bit closer to his teammate on some of those regards. So he ended up in seventh, just behind officially, but my season rating, there was a little bit of a gap between 6th and 9th for my in-season rating. So Charles Leclerc officially came out 6th, as I said earlier, just ahead of his teammate. And where did I have him in the Drivers' Championship? I had him in second for my preseason. And you notice that my Ferrari number 1, though I didn't think that the two drivers were going to actually be into that first Drivers' Championship. I thought their 2 and 3 would actually overtake Max Verstappen in that first position, as I didn't think Max's teammate was actually going to be able to hold on to get them into that first position like they ended up in. So that's kind of where my thought was at their preseason. And where did I end up for my in-season rating for Charles? It was in 6th, so pretty roughly the same standard where he ended up officially with a score of 7.2. So how did the two drivers stack up against each other? We can see here in this graph with Charles in red and Carlos in blue. We have the races that they had this season at the bottom and the position where they ended up for each of those races on the x-axis. And of course, you want to be the lower on this graph is the better, because that's where your position number 1 would be. And of course, right there in the middle of this graph is that 10th position. So that's anything below that or on that, I guess, technically is scored official points for the Drivers' Championship. So that's where you want to be, there or below. Anything above that is not that great, as it's just kind of, if there's a tie on points, kind of roughly trying to figure out that positioning there. So you also see a couple of trend lines here. You see that Carlos in blue is going up, which is actually bad. So he was getting worse throughout this season, where Charles Leclerc was going down, which is actually good. That means he was ended up in a better position at the end of the season than he did at the beginning of the season. And you can see that Charles had some issues at the very beginning of the season. And then they both had some issues in that mid-season and late season where actually Carlos was having more issues at the end of the season than he was at the very beginning. And I think that tends to pull that trend line up. So that's why he's actually getting worse, is because of those offs, or that car was having the issues at the end of the season versus near the beginning. Now you also see that Charles had that U.S. race that was knocked off his list, and that's why there's a break in his line because of the disqualification on that Ferrari. But here you can kind of get an idea of how well they compare to each other, see if the ups and downs semi-matched where they were, so you can see if it's the vehicle that was kind of performing well or not so well in each race versus how they compared to each other as teammates. So you can kind of see here that Carlos was actually doing fairly good at the beginning, with Charles having those dips that was actually getting more points, but was overall probably not as good as Carlos was at the beginning of the season. But as the season progressed, Charles got better and more consistent, whereas Carlos had more offs in that regard. So even though Carlos was getting more points in that mid-season markers, he had more offs at the end, which kind of overtook that setting for those point-wise, and that's kind of why it threw. So I think they're fairly competent to each other. I think Carlos was just making a few more mistakes, didn't optimize his drives as well as Charles did in each session. I think that's why my scores, in-season scores, were slightly different for the two drivers, is I thought Carlos could have done a better job in that Ferrari, minimizing some of those issues that he had and be able to actually get the most out of that Ferrari. So how did the two drivers compare to the drivers around them? So we'll start off with Carlos Sainz in 7th position with 200 points, and just behind him was George Russell with 175 in red here, and just ahead of him was Lando Norris in yellow with 205 points. Same kind of graph that you can look here, so you can kind of guess that the lower the better. The trend lines are showing, of course, Lando gaining much ground throughout the season because of that McLaren started off so poorly and had a much better mid-season to late season run than their start of the season that they had after that. Well, actually, before the big update that they brought for that McLaren. So you can kind of see George Russell here in red having quite a bit of offs throughout the whole season. But when he was not going off in those bad positions, he was actually doing fairly well in the points standings there. So all of his areas was either really bad or gaining points. So that's a kind of steady line that you can see for him in that trend line there. So that's really good for George. If he can just minimize, the issues that he's having going off, he'll improve significantly, I think. And then, of course, you have Lando Norris compared to Carlos from that yellow and blue lines, where Lando started off the season poorly and then ended up getting better. So you can kind of compare those two lines where they had a trade-off at the end of the season. Depending on what races, it seems like they kind of swapped, even though there's a couple of races that they were closer to each other on. But that kind of gives you a kind of nice feel, I think, for how to compare to the two drivers that were around him this season and throughout this season, kind of gauging how well they were driving in each of those vehicles. And you kind of, course, have to take into account, as I said, because of that McLaren was doing so poorly at the beginning, you have to take that into account. So it's not like the driver just improved that much or was having those issues. You can kind of gauge that on how those vehicles were throughout the season, and if they were continually getting decent updates or if their updates were, stagnating or going the wrong direction as well. You have to keep that in mind. So that gives us a nice, good look at Carlos. Now, where did Charles come in? So you can see Charles here in blue. in that fifth position with 206 points. And then you have Lando Norris just behind him in that 205 points in red. And just ahead of him was Fernando Alonso with 206 points in yellow. So here you can see Fernando having a much better start of the season than the other two drivers, and then losing that ground kind of mid-season to late season, as that Aston Martin did not be able to get the updates it needed to maintain that lead over the two other drivers here. And of course, that progresses with that trend line of going up, which is bad, and where you have Charles and Lando are going down, which is good. So if you can compare Charles Leclerc in blue against Lando in red, you can kind of see that they both had a kind of a rough start, even though that Charles had a better start probably than Lando did, and then was able to maintain that with a couple of exceptions, in the Netherlands and, of course, in Brazil. And, of course, he had that one-off disqualification in the United States, which hurt him as well in the actually officially getting points. Even though it didn't count here towards the trend line going bad because it just didn't get a data point here. But he didn't quite increase his performance as fast as Lando, mainly because of that McLaren switch of directions. That midseason really helped that McLaren, whereas Ferrari was trying to bring updates throughout the whole season, and that worked, but probably not as well as they were hoping to. And of course, they had some issues with some of the strategies that were kind of hurt them in some of those point standings as well. But that kind of gives you a nice, good look of where they compared to each other once they get closer to each constructor being similar on pace to each other as well, and how they ended up. So it's kind of hard here to see because you have the McLaren getting much better, the Aston Martin getting worse, and the Ferrari kind of staying the same throughout this season. So you kind of have to judge each part of the season against each other. So speaking of teams, we can look at the team graph here. This is just a nice little bar graph of where the teams gain points across the season. And this gives you a nice good look at the trend lines for the teams themselves. So you have Ferrari here in blue with 406 points. Mercedes in yellow just ahead of them with 409 points. And McLaren just behind them with 302 points. So quite a bit behind the Ferrari, and the Mercedes was the McLaren. But if you're looking at the Ferrari, they were kind of closer to the Mercedes with kind of nice lead on McLaren, even though McLaren was coming up strong at the end of the season. And you kind of get just a bird's eye look here. So you can see at the very beginning, of course, McLaren, hardly see any red or if that's orange. And then you have the Ferrari having a nice even pace, as well as the Mercedes across the board, 4 points. Even though they weren't maybe the maximum points that they would have liked, you can kind of see that across the board and see the trend lines. So you see Mercedes getting worse throughout the season, because going down, you're getting less points throughout the season, whereas McLaren was going fairly strong increase, and Ferrari had a slightly less increase, but still increasing through the end of the season. So you can kind of look at that and kind of get a good judge of how well they were doing throughout the season and where the development was performing and coming into play. So from that, we will look at a nice step graph of the three teams. And of course, you see the McLaren at the very bottom, started off the season very poorly, ended up in that mid-season starting to gain ground, but not gaining the ground enough to overtake the two teams ahead of them. With that 100-point gap between the two fairly easily, not quite close. They were made the most of what they could. And of course, you have Ferrari in blue, which never really overtook Ferrari, but they kind of started off near the same, and then had a little bit of dip, and then kind of maintained that near the end, where Mercedes started to drop off, but not quite enough for Ferrari to overtake them. And of course, Mercedes, of course, is that yellow, this fairly straight line, even though they had a little bit of peaks in there, and they kind of started to level off a little bit near the end as well. So what was your thoughts on Ferrari? Do you think they could have been better than they were? Or do you think that this is about all they could have ended up with due to this season characteristics? Anyway, so what I have coming up next, of course, is Mercedes. And how well did they stack up against the teams around them and the drivers around them? And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And if you really want to see my Mercedes stack up video, I'd appreciate a subscribe so you don't miss that. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.